In this video, we're going to talk about assembly groups and how they impact CPR counts and calculations. So assembly groups add a new twist to how calculations are performed when going from an assembly or assembly group construction unit over to the CPR. So let's start off with just an example of an assembly group. So in this case, we have a 30-foot pole with an A1, and the code that we're going to be using is P30A1.01. So that's our assembly group. That actually represents multiple assemblies. And so to keep this simple, we just are using an assembly group example with just two assemblies associated to it. We have a 30-foot pole, and that's a P30-5, and there's a single one of those. And then we have an A1, which is an A1.01, and it has a count of 2. So we're basically saying that anytime we install or remove this assembly group, we're going to be having one pole and two of these A1s. So the A1s actually have multiple materials associated to them. So you've got things like multiple bolts and some different types of insulators that are associated to it, but we're not going to go into the details of the material level. We're really going to stick to just the assembly group level and the assembly level. So over on the right here, we have an example. We have a work order that just has a single layout, and the actual action is an installation. So we're going to do an installation of our P30A1.01 assembly group, and we have a count of 2. And so that's going to really come into play because we're going to be doing some interesting calculations, and it's more noticeable when you have multiple assembly groups being installed or removed at the same time. And this is a non-linear type of assembly, and that actually makes it a little bit easier to do these calculations. You generally aren't going to have a linear assembly group, so that usually doesn't come into play anyways. So how does this layout record then get broken down? So we have a concept called layout assemblies. And layout assemblies are in the database, and they were designed specifically so that any time an assembly group was installed or removed, we could represent the assemblies associated to it. So in this case, you see that we have the two assemblies that we have over here, the 30-foot pole and the A1. So we've got their assembly codes listed right there. And then next to that, we have the various values associated to that. So that's kind of the key thing, or what are these values that then get calculated every single time we either add one of these layout records or update it or remove it. And so in this case, we're going to take a look at the assembly count each. And so I've got a little comment that goes up here, so let me show that. So it's the number of assemblies associated to the assembly group. And so in this case, for the P30-5, the pole, he said there's just one of those. So there's one pole associated to it, so that's this number, this count over here of 1. And for the A1, we're going to have 2 of those, so that represents that value. If I were to go to the actual screens in OpenPoint, you would see that here we are on the P30A1.01 assembly group, and that when you go to the assemblies tab over here, this is showing the assembly count. That's that same value. So we have a 1 of the poles, and we have 2 of these A1s. And so let's go back here. So the next value over is the assembly CPR account. So in that case, we're actually going back to the assembly record itself for each one of these values, and we're looking at the CPR account for that. So if I were to go back to that screen, so here we are on the A101 assembly, and over here on the right here, the CPR count is 1. So almost always that count is going to be 1, or it could even be 0, but it's generally not going to be 2 or more unless you have a situation like, let's say, a double cross arm. So since those generally count as 2 CPR units in the CPR ledger, that's when you would see a 2 in that particular case. So the next one that we have is the assembly count. And so that's going to be the total number of a particular assembly on the layout. It's associated to that layout record. So the key thing there is how you do the calculation. So, so what you do is you actually start off with the original layout count. So we've got this count of 2, and you multiply it by the assembly count each, which is really, again, it's these counts here. So let's take a look at this for the A101 example. So we've got our 2, so we have 2 of these overall assembly groups, and we're going to multiply that by the number of A1s, which is 2 in this case, to get our assembly count value of 4 for the A101. The next one over is the CPR account. So that is ultimately the count that's going to impact the CPR ledger. At the end of the day, this is what we really care about. This is where the calculations all result in. And so, so how it does this is, again, it's going to go back to that layout count, and then it's going to multiply it by the assembly count each, and then from there it's going to multiply it by the assembly CPR count. So we basically take, you know, the original count here of 2 multiplied by the count each here, and then if there happens to be a CPR count greater than 1, then in that case it would do that final count to get this number here. So you can see that's 2 times 2 times 1 is what gives us our 4 right there. So there's also some more information we can talk about as far as CPR count each. If you want to read that at some point, you can do that. It's really only useful for linear situations. It's really not helpful in assembly groups at all, but it does always calculate that. So you might see that value in some places, but in reality, it's a limited use case for linear situations where you actually have to modify the layout at a later date. And so that about wraps up the basic concept. And you can take a look at certain reports to kind of see this in action. So we're working on a number of things that can help make this more clear. And so hopefully this video was helpful in that regard.